As Emily continued on her way, she had no idea that Karen was watching from behind her front window. She was just going about her business, listening to the peaceful hum of the neighborhood with no thought of causing any trouble. Little did she know, Karen's sharp, judgmental eyes were locked on her every move. Karen had lived in the neighborhood for several years, and anyone who had lived here long enough had likely encountered her at some point. She was the kind of neighbor who always had something to say. Whether it was about your lawn not being perfectly manicured, your mailbox being a little askew, or your dog barking once in a while, Karen was there with her unsolicited opinion. But until that evening, we hadn't had any direct interactions with her, so we assumed she was just another person trying to keep to herself. But as soon as Emily's feet hit the sidewalk near Karen's house, everything changed. Emily had just finished a long day at work and was trying to get home to relax, but instead she found herself the target of a ridiculous complaint. It was hard for me to fathom that someone would be so sensitive about something as trivial as footsteps. What could she possibly be thinking? Emily was minding her own business, walking calmly and quietly. Her pace was steady, her mind was at ease, and the only sound that accompanied her were the occasional chirps of birds and the rustling of the leaves in the breeze. It was serene. The only thing in the world at that moment was Emily's peaceful walk, and she felt safe in the quiet hum of suburban life. But to Karen, that peace was shattered. From the comfort of her living room, where she had apparently been sitting in complete silence, she suddenly became aware of the sound of footsteps on the pavement. To her, the sound of Emily's feet hitting the ground must have felt like an invasion of her personal space, and it triggered something inside of her. In an instant, Karen was on her phone. She dialed 911, describing the disturbance that was happening right outside her house. The call went something like this. "Yes, hello. There's someone walking past my house, and the noise from their footsteps is so loud it's disturbing my peace. It's a pregnant woman, and I don't know what to do about this disturbance." At this point, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I had to take a moment to process the absurdity of the situation. How on earth could walking be considered a disturbance? We were talking about the sound of footsteps, not an engine revving or loud music blaring. I couldn't just sit idly by, so I quickly walked out of the house and saw Emily standing there, confused and upset. I could see the hurt in her eyes. This was a moment she didn't deserve. How could anyone, let alone a neighbor, turn something so ordinary into such an issue? It didn't make any sense to me. By the time I stepped outside, the 911 operator had already confirmed that an officer would be dispatched to investigate the situation. I was both shocked and angry. I couldn't understand how Karen had escalated something so trivial to an emergency situation. To her, it didn't seem to matter that a pregnant woman was walking down the street in the quiet of the evening. What mattered to Karen was her personal discomfort, and she felt entitled enough to involve the police. It was a hard pill to swallow, but what was even more frustrating was how Karen continued to double down on her absurd complaint. She didn't even seem to realize how far out of line she was. From her perspective, it was clear that she had every right to call 911 over the sound of footsteps. Maybe it was the power trip of thinking she could control others in the neighborhood, or maybe she just enjoyed creating chaos where there was none. But whatever it was, she had made it clear that her peace was more important than anyone else's. As Emily and I stood there, waiting for the police to arrive, I couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of frustration. I understood that some people were particularly sensitive to noise, but this wasn't about noise. This was about an unreasonable sense of entitlement. Karen had decided that her version of peace was the only valid one, and everyone else had to adhere to it, regardless of the impact it had on the people around her. This wasn't just a case of a noise complaint. This was a demonstration of someone who thought their feelings were more important than the well-being of others. It was a clear example of how entitlement can spiral into something ridiculous. How it can lead to controlling behavior that disrupts the peace and tranquility of others for no reason other than a sense of self-importance. As I waited for the officer to arrive, I felt a knot in my stomach. I knew that the situation was going to escalate in ways we couldn't predict. What if Karen continued to make trouble for us in the future? What if this was just the beginning of a long string of unreasonable complaints? I turned to Emily and assured her that we would handle this together, no matter what. The last thing we needed was to live in fear of a neighbor who thought she had the right to control everything around her. But as the officer arrived, I realized that this was a defining moment. This was a moment when we would stand up for what was right, no matter how ridiculous the situation seemed. We weren't just standing up for ourselves. We were standing up for everyone in the neighborhood who might one day find themselves at the mercy of a Karen. And in that moment, I knew that no matter how small the issue, we were not going to let it slide. We would fight for our right to walk down the street without fear of being accused of disturbing someone's precious peace. Karen's voice was loud and harsh as she stormed out of her front door. Her arms flailing in the air as she shouted about how Emily's footsteps were disturbing her peace. Emily stood there, frozen in disbelief, unable to comprehend what was unfolding. How could something as mundane as walking become a crime? How could her simple stroll to unwind after a long day of work be twisted into such an absurd accusation? The most puzzling part was that Karen didn't stop at yelling across the street. No, she escalated the situation to a level that in my wildest dreams I never thought possible. With one swift motion, she pulled out her phone, dialed 911, and began explaining the situation in the most dramatic way possible. The operator on the other end of the line seemed equally confused. 911, what's your emergency? The operator asked, trying to make sense of Karen's frantic words. My neighbor is walking too loudly, Karen responded, her tone sharp and incredulous. Her footsteps are so disruptive, they're ruining my peace. I'm trying to enjoy my afternoon, and this noise is unbearable. I could hear Karen's voice rising in a mixture of frustration and hysteria. She went on to inform the dispatcher that Emily was pregnant, which, according to Karen, only exacerbated the issue. She's pregnant, and she's stomping around like a herd of elephants. This needs to be addressed, Karen insisted. I was stunned, utterly speechless. The sheer audacity of it all left me in disbelief. How could anyone possibly take her seriously? A noise complaint over footsteps on a quiet street no less was beyond my understanding. But here we were, with the police potentially on their way, all because Emily was walking down the sidewalk. In the midst of this, I could see Emily standing there, her expression a mixture of confusion, embarrassment, and frustration. She had never been involved in any conflict like this before, and here she was, being accused of something she couldn't even fathom. I could tell it was taking a toll on her as she tried to process what was happening. It wasn't just the fact that Karen had made such an absurd complaint, but the idea that someone would go to such lengths to involve the police over a minor inconvenience. The 911 operator, sensing the ridiculousness of the situation, asked Karen to clarify the nature of the disturbance. What exactly is the issue here? The operator inquired, likely trying to piece together the puzzle of what sounded like a nonsensical complaint. Karen was having none of it. She reiterated her claim as though it was a matter of life or death. It's the noise, the constant thud, thud, thud of her steps as she walks past my house. I can't concentrate. I can't relax. It's driving me crazy. I could hear the operator's voice soften, perhaps trying to diffuse the situation with calm tone. Ma'am, I understand you're frustrated, but footsteps alone don't constitute a disturbance that would warrant police intervention. There was a pause before the operator continued. If this is not an emergency, you might want to reconsider this request. At this point, Karen's tone shifted slightly, as if realizing the absurdity of her complaint in the face of the operator's calm responses. But she wasn't ready to back down. She doubled down, demanding that the police come out to handle the situation. I'm not asking for much. I just want someone to come and take care of this. She's disturbing my peace. It was maddening. Karen's sense of entitlement was so strong that she thought a simple walk down the street could be equated to a criminal act. I could only imagine how the operator felt, stuck in the middle of this absurd conversation, trying to keep the situation from escalating further. I couldn't help but wonder what went through Karen's mind as she made the call. Did she really believe she was in the right? Did she think the police would show up, arrest my wife, and somehow restore her precious peace? Emily, still standing there in shock, gave me a helpless look. She was trying to wrap her head around the fact that someone could be so petty, so wrapped up in their own world, that they would go as far as calling the police over something as innocuous as walking. I could see that the situation was weighing on her, and the last thing I wanted was for her to feel threatened or intimidated. After all, she was just trying to get home, not cause any trouble. Karen, however, wasn't interested in understanding the situation from any perspective other than her own. It didn't matter to her that Emily was simply going about her day. All that mattered was her perception of noise and how it seemed to irritate her beyond reason. For her, that was enough to demand police intervention. As the call continued, it became more and more apparent that Karen was not going to back down. She wasn't willing to accept that her complaint was anything but legitimate. In her mind, this was a battle worth fighting, and she wasn't going to let something as insignificant as common sense get in the way of her victimhood. And there we were, stuck in the middle of a completely senseless situation, waiting for the police to arrive and hopefully bring some sanity back to the table. It was a strange, surreal moment, one where I realized just how much some people are willing to escalate the smallest issues to extreme lengths. A simple walk, a small moment of peace in the day, had somehow become a massive issue, all because Karen couldn't tolerate something as insignificant as the sound of footsteps on the sidewalk. By the time the police car rolled up, I was already standing outside, a mixture of anger and disbelief bubbling up inside me. It was hard to wrap my head around the situation. Our normally peaceful neighborhood had turned into a battleground over something as trivial as a quiet evening walk. I couldn't believe that a simple act of walking down the sidewalk had escalated to this point. I watched as the officer stepped out of the patrol car and walked toward Karen, who was still standing there talking a mile a minute about how her peace had been shattered. Her voice was high-pitched and frantic, and I could see the frustration building up in her eyes. She was so wrapped up in her own sense of grievance that she wasn't even considering the ridiculousness of her complaint. I felt a pang of sympathy for the officer, who, judging by his expression, was probably wondering how on earth he had ended up in such a bizarre situation. I could tell this wasn't the kind of thing he was used to handling. The officer turned his attention to Emily, who was standing a few feet away, visibly upset and shaking her head. It was clear that she couldn't understand why someone would go this far over something so insignificant. Karen had already moved into full victim mode, ranting about how Emily's footsteps were somehow damaging her mental well-being. I could see the disbelief in the officer's eyes as he turned back to Karen, trying to remain professional despite the absurdity of it all. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but there's no law against walking past someone's house," the officer said calmly, his voice steady and composed. Noise complaints can be taken seriously, but this doesn't meet the threshold for a disturbance. You can't call 911 every time you hear footsteps. I could see the frustration building in Karen's face, but the officer remained unfazed, his demeanor unshaken by her ranting. She was clearly not willing to accept that her complaint had no merit, but the officer wasn't about to give in. He continued to speak in a calm, measured tone, explaining that this was a situation better handled by communication, not police intervention. "There's no reason for the police to be involved in a situation like this," the officer added. "What you need to do is go back inside and let this cool down. It's not an emergency, and frankly, it's a waste of resources." Karen wasn't satisfied with this response, but the officer remained firm. He politely told her to go back inside and that no further action would be taken. His professionalism was a sharp contrast to Karen's hysteria, and it was clear that he was more interested in de-escalating the situation than indulging her outlandish complaint. I watched as Karen huffed and puffed, clearly annoyed that the officer wasn't taking her side. She muttered something under her breath as she walked back to her house, still complaining about the disturbance Emily had caused. I could tell Karen was the type of person who would never admit when she was in the wrong, and I had a feeling this wouldn't be the last time we'd hear from her. As soon as the officer left, I turned to Emily, who was still standing there, trying to process what had just happened. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. She was trying to come to terms with the fact that someone had made such a big deal out of something so simple. How could anyone get so upset over a walk? She had simply been going about her day, minding her own business, when suddenly she was thrust into this drama. "What just happened?" Emily asked quietly, her voice shaky. "I don't know," I said, shaking my head. "I honestly don't know. But that was ridiculous." We stood there in the street for a few moments, trying to make sense of the situation. It felt surreal, like we had stepped into some kind of bad dream where a simple walk down the sidewalk could turn into a full-blown emergency. I couldn't shake the feeling of disbelief that had settled over me. This was supposed to be a safe, quiet neighborhood, and now it felt like we were under attack by someone who thought their peace was more important than the comfort of everyone else. As we stood there, the weight of the situation began to settle in. Karen had made a spectacle of herself, but I knew that we couldn't just let this go. The situation wasn't just about the ridiculousness of her complaint. It was about standing up for our right to live in peace without fear of being harassed by unreasonable neighbors. Karen had crossed a line, and I wasn't going to let her get away with making us feel uncomfortable in our own neighborhood. But at the same time, I didn't want to escalate things further. I didn't want to play into Karen's hands by giving her the satisfaction of getting a rise out of us. So we decided to take a step back and let things cool off, hoping that this would be the end of it. But deep down, I knew that it wasn't over. This was just the beginning of what would likely be a long, drawn-out saga. As we walked back inside, I couldn't help but think about how this small, everyday moment had turned into something so much bigger. It was a stark reminder that there are people out there who will turn even the smallest issue into a personal vendetta. And in the end, the only thing we could do was stand our ground, take a deep breath, and move on. But one thing was for sure. We weren't going to let Karen's petty behavior define our peace. In the days following the 911 call and police involvement, the atmosphere in our neighborhood changed. Our quiet, tight-knit community was never the same. Word spread quickly through texts, group chats, and casual conversations that Karen had called 911 on my pregnant wife, all because of a few footsteps. At first, I couldn't quite process the full weight of it. But as more neighbors reached out, both with concern and disbelief, it became clear. This wasn't just a small, isolated incident. It was a warning sign that Karen wasn't just a quirky neighbor with an odd sense of entitlement. She was a disruptive force who could turn the simplest situations into a nightmare. Many of the people in our neighborhood were genuinely shocked. These were people we had known for years, some of them friends, others friendly acquaintances. I never imagined that one of them would escalate something so trivial to such a level. Our neighbors were stunned and, in some cases, worried about what this meant for the future. They knew Karen had been outspoken in the past, but nobody ever expected her to cross this line. The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. If Karen could make a scene over something so small, what else was she capable of? But the most disturbing part of this whole ordeal wasn't just the call to 911. It was how Karen handled the fallout afterward. Most people would have been embarrassed, realizing how unreasonable they'd been. Most people would have apologized, maybe even quietly backed off, acknowledging that they had overreacted. Not Karen. Instead of taking responsibility or offering any form of contrition, she doubled down on her ridiculous behavior. A few days after the incident, we received a letter in our mailbox from the neighborhood's homeowners association. I opened it with a sinking feeling, already knowing what it was about. It was a formal complaint from Karen about noise violations, but this wasn't just a standard complaint. Karen had requested the HOA install a noise monitoring system to track any future disturbances, particularly loud walkers like my wife. I had to read the letter twice to fully comprehend it. Was she seriously asking for the HOA to police the neighborhood to this extent? Was she trying to create some kind of dystopian environment where even the most innocent of actions were scrutinized? I was flabbergasted. The audacity of it. This wasn't just a complaint about noise anymore. It was a full-on attempt to control the neighborhood in a way that no one had ever imagined. It made me realize that this wasn't a one-off incident. It was part of a larger pattern of behavior. Karen wasn't just trying to make a point about her peace being disrupted. She was trying to impose her will on everyone around her. And that was the moment I knew we had to take action. I couldn't let this slide. As much as I wanted to avoid conflict, this had escalated beyond what any reasonable person would tolerate. If we let this go, it would set a precedent. Karen would think she could get away with anything. And if she could get away with this, what would stop her from escalating even further? The entire neighborhood could be at risk of becoming a battleground of complaints and unreasonable demands where no one was safe from the next bizarre issue she decided to create. So I started talking to our neighbors, some of whom had seen Karen's behavior before. The more people I spoke to, the more I realized that we weren't alone in our frustration. Some neighbors expressed their sympathy, offering support and assuring us they had our backs. Others had been dealing with Karen's antics for years, stories of her harassing other families, complaining about lawn decorations, and even reporting trivial matters to the HOA. I was floored to learn that we weren't the first victims of her irrational behavior. In fact, it seemed like we were just the latest in a long line of families who had been forced to deal with her disruptive tendencies. One neighbor, who had lived next door to Karen for over a decade, confided in me that Karen had been causing problems for years. He had witnessed her yelling at children for playing too loudly in the yard, demanding that neighbors trim their trees because the branches were too close to her fence, and even writing letters to the HOA about issues that no one else cared about. He said that it wasn't uncommon for her to file complaints about the smallest things, things that wouldn't even cross the mind of a normal, reasonable person. But once she latched onto something, she wouldn't let go. The realization hit me hard. Karen wasn't just a one-time troublemaker. She was a serial complainer who thrived on stirring up conflict. And as much as I wanted to let things go and move on, I knew that if we didn't address this now, it would only get worse. The HOA, too, had been too lenient in the past, allowing her complaints to fester without taking action. It became clear that we needed to come together with the other neighbors who were fed up with Karen's antics and demand that the HOA take stronger action. The next steps weren't easy. We began to organize, speaking with other neighbors who were also affected by Karen's behavior. We filed our own complaints with the HOA, demanding that they intervene and set clear boundaries. We made it clear that Karen's behavior was unacceptable and that the HOA needed to take a stronger stance against her disruptive tactics. It wasn't just about the footsteps anymore. It was about setting a precedent for the entire neighborhood. We had to show that we wouldn't stand by while one person tried to control everything. And while things didn't get resolved overnight, it was the first step in reclaiming our neighborhood from the chaos that Karen had unleashed. We had to unite as a community and stand firm against her petty complaints. I knew it would be a long road, but I also knew that if we didn't act now, Karen would continue to wreak havoc, making our lives miserable in the process. In the end, it wasn't just about the absurdity of Karen's complaint. It was about taking a stand against unreasonable behavior and ensuring that our neighborhood remained a place where everyone could live in peace without fear of being harassed over trivial matters. The fallout from the incident made it clear that we couldn't ignore Karen's actions, and I was prepared to do whatever it took to protect our home, our peace, and our sanity. Despite the stress and frustration that Karen had caused, Emily and I made a conscious decision that we wouldn't let her petty behavior dictate our lives. It would have been easy to let her win, to quietly retreat into the background and avoid further confrontation. But that wasn't the kind of people we were. This wasn't just about us anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. It was about ensuring that no one else in our neighborhood would ever have to face the kind of unreasonable treatment we'd been subjected to. We knew that the only way to protect ourselves and our neighbors was to take action. So we began to document everything. Every bizarre complaint, every call she made to the HOA, and every over-the-top demand for changes that had no real basis in reality. We knew that if we didn't keep track of her behavior, it would be too easy for her to continue causing problems without anyone noticing. We made sure to write down the dates of her complaints, take screenshots of any emails she sent to the HOA, and keep records of our conversations with neighbors who had witnessed her antics. It wasn't just about protecting ourselves. It was about standing up for everyone in the neighborhood. If we let Karen get away with her unreasonable demands and actions, it would set a dangerous precedent for everyone else. We couldn't allow someone like her to disrupt the peace of our community without consequences. We needed to send a message that petty behavior, harassment, and unreasonable complaints wouldn't be tolerated. In the weeks that followed, we kept our heads down but remained vigilant. We worked with the HOA to ensure that future complaints from Karen wouldn't be taken seriously without valid evidence. The HOA had been hesitant to take action before, but after reviewing Karen's history of complaints, they began to see the pattern. They realized that Karen wasn't just a concerned neighbor. She was a troublemaker who thrived on creating chaos where there was none. They assured us that they would be more proactive in addressing any future complaints from her and that they would be taking a harder stance on her behavior. Working with the HOA was a turning point. For the first time, we felt like we had the support we needed. The HOA's willingness to listen to our concerns and take action gave us the confidence to keep moving forward. We knew we weren't alone in this fight, and that made all the difference. As we continued documenting Karen's behavior and working with the HOA, we also started to have more conversations with our neighbors, and that's when things really began to shift. At first, some of our neighbors had been hesitant to get involved, unsure of how to handle the situation or worried about creating more conflict. But as they saw Karen's antics unfold and heard about the support we were receiving from the HOA, many of them began to speak up. They shared their own stories of dealing with Karen's complaints, stories of her trying to control the neighborhood, making unreasonable demands, and harassing families who had done nothing wrong. Slowly but surely, a sense of solidarity began to form. We weren't just fighting for ourselves, we were fighting for the peace and well-being of the entire neighborhood. By the time the dust settled, Karen's influence had started to wane. The more people in the neighborhood learned about her history of complaints and the lengths she was willing to go to make others' lives miserable, the less credibility she had. People stopped taking her seriously. When she tried to stir up trouble, it was clear to everyone around her that her complaints weren't based on any real issues. They were just a way for her to assert control over the neighborhood. Her reputation, once a source of power, had begun to crumble. And as for Emily and me, we were stronger than ever. The ordeal with Karen had brought us closer together as we worked side by side to stand up for what was right. But it also brought us closer to the neighbors who had our backs. We had formed a community united against one person's unreasonable behavior, and that sense of camaraderie was invaluable. We knew that, no matter what Karen tried next, we wouldn't let her tear us apart. In the end, Karen's antics didn't break us. Instead, they helped us realize the importance of standing up for our values, protecting our peace, and supporting each other. It became clear that when we work together, we can overcome even the most ridiculous challenges. We no longer lived in fear of her petty complaints. We could walk down the street, talk to our neighbors, and enjoy our lives without constantly looking over our shoulders, wondering when Karen would strike again. And most importantly, we knew that we had the power to protect our peace and stand our ground no matter how small or insignificant the issue seemed. The lesson here? Don't let the unreasonable people in your life take away your peace. Stand up for what's right, even when it feels like the world is against you. It's not always easy, but it's always worth it. When you stand your ground and fight for what you believe in, you'll come out stronger on the other side. And the next time someone like Karen tries to make trouble, you'll know exactly how to handle it. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more wild hallway stories, neighborhood drama, and personal experiences. Let us know in the comments if you've ever had a run-in with a Karen. We'd love to hear your story. Your voice matters, and together we can make sure that unreasonable behavior doesn't get the best of us. Stay strong, stay united, and keep fighting for your peace.